So why impious? People have been asking me. And well, the answer is that this series of talks wants to focus on the process of the journey, but also on the reasons and strategies behind traveling. So I thought that an aspect of this that links together the journeys between the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles is the ubiquitous conflict of the faith. Cultural, political, mercantile exchanges were colored by these suspicions or by accusations of impiety between Protestants and Catholics. So the term impious or impious, if you prefer, brings forward this antagonism or conflict. However, also attempts to establish alliances and bring together both communities existed and were a fertile ground of cross-fertilization, which is another of the topics of this seminar series. So I hope that in the next few weeks or the next 3 sessions, we will be able to navigate our way along these itineraries that brought together the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles, and hopefully learn something on the way. Well, I also want to explain briefly the image that illustrates this seminar series, and I want to share my, sorry, am I sharing?
No, not yet.
No, I'm not sharing.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this is a disaster because this is not what I should be sharing. I want to share. Sorry. I want to share the first image, which is there. And so there we go. There we go. Sorry, this is the image that well has been used to publicize the series. Why was this happening? This is something happening strange.
Yeah.
With my PowerPoint. I'm so sorry.
There, there you are.
Well, well, what I want to explain is that this is a painting that decorates the chapel of the English College at Valladolid. And that this painting depicts one of the many episodes of confrontation between Elizabethan England and Spanish Spain for Philip II. But this is a far less known episode than the Spanish Armada failed attack on English coast. The attack on the harbor of Cadiz to destroy the Spanish fleet in 1596 was quite successful, causing huge damages on the town and humiliating Spain in its own territory. The town dwellers, striving to protect an image of the Virgin, what you see there, with child, as the English and Dutch fleets are approaching, conveys a moment that inspired Cervantes to write one of his exemplary novels. That this painting was commissioned almost a century later for the chapel of the seminar for Catholic English priests established by Philip is very telling. The English Catholic exiles would want to remind the Spaniards of how dangerous the Protestant enemies could be, while both the Spanish and English governments had tried to silence this shameful event and bury it in oblivion. Neither the painting nor the episodes that it commemorates are very frequently seen or mentioned. And I'm using this painting, I chose this to represent the aim and scope of this series with its reference to travel, to transformation and transnational conflict. The 6 speakers in the series are all members of an international research project funded by the Spanish Ministerio of Science and Innovation that is called Missions and Transmissions, Exchanges between the Iberia and the British Isles in the early modern period. And I want to thank them as well as the Warburg Institute for enabling this event to happen. So that without further delay, I am going to pass on to Mark, who is going to chair this session. And I want to stop sharing. So Mark.
Thank you very much, Berta.
My introduction will only be a very brief delay to the two papers. I'd like to welcome you all to the first of our 3 sessions on Impious Itineraries. Our itinerary today is the beginning and almost the end of the Jacobean reign, which was bookended by the peacemaking between England and Spain and the descent into peace breaking that precipitated the outbreak of hostilities once again in 1625, some 6 months after the death of King James I and VI. Our 2 papers today will last for around 25 minutes, and then we will open up the session for questions. I'll introduce each of the speakers separately, again, very briefly, so that we can get to the papers without too much delay from me. And following the papers, I will explain briefly how the Q&A will go, well, subject to technology, of course, and to this chair, although I'm sure many of us are familiar already with the procedure and so on, but I'll just remind us all. And hopefully we will have plenty of time for questions from the 2 papers that we're about to have. Our first speaker you've just heard from is Berta Cano Echevarría, and she is Professor Titular, Associate Professor in the Department of English Philology at the University of Valladolid and Visiting Fellow at the Warburg Institute. Her paper today is part of an ongoing project on the Anglo-Spanish peace of 1603-5, and she is going to present on the topic of English perambulations of the Count of Villamediana in 1603. Thanks, Berta.
Okay, Mark, thanks. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if now I'm more successful in sharing my PowerPoint and it doesn't go anywhere. Right, so that should be it. Okay, a few years after the events in Cádiz that I mentioned before in the introduction, and under the new monarchies of James I and Philip III, the possibility of peace started to be explored. Precisely, this peace settlement is commemorated in this other, much more famous painting. There are more questions than answers surrounding the production and intention of such a remarkable group portrait. Who painted it? Is it true that the inscription down here that tells us that it was painted by Juan Pantoja de la Cruz for Mi Señor, in all probability Philip III, are fake? And if so, who commissioned it? Who owned it? What vicissitudes happened before both extant copies arrived in England, where they are kept now? For our purposes today, however, I just want to fix your attention on the sitters in the portrait who have their hand on their chest. So, like the famous picture by El Greco, or the nobleman with his hand on his chest, these 4 men adopt the gesture of taking an oath. And remarkably, these were the 4 leaders of the negotiation. So I believe that the artist is using this gesture of their hands to single them out from the rest of the sitters. Whether the hand they are using, the left or the right, is also symbolic is another matter. But on the English side, you can see here Robert Cecil, who is also in charge of the paper, and Penn as Secretary of State. And at the back, also with his hand there, the Earl of Nottingham, who would lead the embassy to Spain a year later. On the left-hand side, this the Spanish side, if you want, we have Charles de Ligne, who was the Count of Arenberg and the ambassador to the Archdukes. And at the back here, Juan de Tassis, Count of Villamediana, the Spanish ambassador that negotiated the peace from the beginning. Even though behind him we have the Constable of Castilla, who had a higher rank, His less conspicuous presence could be explained because he was only present in the final session of the negotiations. And actually, if this were a photograph, as it looks very much like, it would have been taken on that one last session when Castilla was present. But for this session to take place, long, complicated negotiations whose protagonists are here had to take place. And these protagonists were, as I say, Arenberg, Villamediana, and Cecil. Nottingham would be protagonists later on. My purpose today is to go back to the very beginning when the negotiations had not yet even started, to observe how all parties involved played their cards strategically to establish the conditions for this concerted reapproachment, and how the unexpectedly long route of Villamediana in England, before he could be received by James, was used as a means of propaganda for the Spanish party, and left a deep impression among the English people that met him on his way to the court. When James acceded to the throne with the help of Robert Cecil, the different European courts sent congratulatory letters and ambassadors. Not so Spain, who procrastinated for a little while and resolved which policy to follow, since James was by no means their chosen successor. However, it soon became clear that James had been accepted without much opposition, and that the best course of action would be to join the congratulatory messages and explore the new monarch's position concerning peace with Spain. So by the time that Villamediana was sent with his congratulatory letters, all the other ambassadors had already preceded him. Most importantly, Arenberg, who was among the first to arrive from Brussels, and also Monsieur Rosny, the great treasurer of France and extraordinary ambassador for the occasion. Villamediana's anxiety was to be treated with at least the same deference as the French ambassador, Rosny, had been treated. At stake were Spanish prestige and the possibility of an advantageous peace settlement. Every gesture had to be calibrated, and if England wanted an agreement, they too had to make an ostensible effort that he could report back home. The most complete account of the journey and first audience of the Count of Villamediana is an anonymous pamphlet which was published in 2 installments. Relacion muy verdadera del recebimiento y fiestas covers the journey until just before the first audience with the king is about to take place, whereas la segunda parte de la embajada de Don Juan de Tassis recounts the troubles or travails, as would be said at the time, of the embassy before they are finally received by James at Winchester on the 5th of October, 1603, almost 2 months after they had departed from Brussels. The impatience in Spain to learn what was happening in the embassy may well be the reason why the chronicler decided to divide in 2 pamphlets his account of a journey that was taking much longer than initially planned, as the 1603 Relacion muy verdadera ended with the optimistic promise that the audience was about to happen, and the only in the segunda parte, that was not published until 1604, do we learn that the journey had to be prolonged and the audience postponed. So both pamphlets follow the conventions of the genre. They are short, impersonal, anonymous, and factual, and they are designed to inform their readers with apparent dryness of the perambulations of the embassy, giving details of the dates and locations of the itinerary. In the case of these pamphlets, the primary intention behind them is or was to make the Spanish readers come to terms with the idea of peace with England, while at the same time displaying the grandeur of the Spanish embassy and the impact it had on the English people. Every opportunity to describe the pomp and splendor of the cortege is taken, and possible moments of friction are omitted. So Relación muy verdadera starts by offering a detailed description of the retinue that was gathered to travel with Juan de Tassis. Apart from the noblemen of his house and the family members that accompanied, he was accompanied by 2 captains, one of cavalry and one of infantry, 3 secretaries, 4 cooks with their assistants, 3 chaplains, 2 trumpeters, a doctor, an apothecary, and a number of private servants, lackeys and footmen, all of them with their livery and the necessary apparel. These made a total of around 150 men, 25 horses and 3 ceremonial carriages, plus all the carts loaded with the luggage. In the National Archive, and here you can see one, are kept 3 different documents containing the lists of the members of the Spanish embassy. This is one of them, and this gives the total of 144 as a number. There is another one that gives 147, another one that gives 145, but in any case, what they show is the interest that English authorities had on the exact number and composition of this large cortege. Villamediana's arrival had been carefully orchestrated, and both guests and hosts had a clear plan to follow in order to allow little room for misinterpretation or confusion. Conscious of the expectation, Cecil writes, he, and meaning Villamediana, is very inquisitive after the manner of Roney's entertainment, lest he should digest any usage inferior to his, in which respect we have been curious to observe such ceremonies as in as great equality as can be. So Louis Luckner was, who had been appointed very recently Master of Ceremonies, was sent to greet Villamediana in Dover. Then the Earl of Danvers was going to meet him at Canterbury, and the Earl of Devonshire was sent to receive him in Oxford. And all of them equal in position as the noblemen that received the French embassy. Now, ambassadors' reliance on precedence, ceremony, and protocol brought a sense of repeated structure that reassured those involved. As in a play with a given script, ambassadors carry instructions they could not depart from and were expected to read their commissions a la letra. However, there was a special talent relatively unaccounted for by scholars, but frequently key to the success of ambassadors in their missions, which was their ability to improvise in a Greenblattian sense of the term. Stephen Greenblatt defines improvisation as the ability to capitalize on the unforeseen and to transform given materials into one's own scenario, seeing it as a mode of behavior crucial to Renaissance forms of power. For Greenblatt, the Europeans' ability to insinuate themselves into the pre-existing political, religious, even psychic structures of other cultures, and to turn those structures to their advantage is more important than the spur of the moment quality, so that a degree of calculation enters the equation as much as impromptu action. These structures had to be, and I quote, sufficiently close to be recognizable, sufficiently distant to be manipulable, end of quote. Even though Greenblatt applies these ideas in a context of colonization, where the divide between the different cultures was much greater than the one between the different European countries, these notions can still apply in our case study. When the English were cautiously greeting the newly arrived Spaniards and the Spaniards eager to impress their hosts, both sides were calculating their moves, while always taking care not to misrepresent the meaning of each other's gestures. So much of what was at stake had to be expressed through non-verbal language, and the Spaniards used the number and size of retinue to emphasize this, while the English resisted this power, appearing to remain unimpressed. For example, Cecil, in a letter at the manner of the procession, says that the Spanish ambassador cometh with a very great train and carried himself conforme a la gravedad española. But he is also curious about whether he has a secret agenda behind him. So he says what his negotiation will be more than congratulatory is yet unknown, but I conceive he will proceed as Arenberg did at first, who pretended no necessity where there hath been no breach of amity, for else he would think it were a diminution of his master's greatness to be this first tender where there were no friendship. This, of course, is because there had not been the war had never been declared, so they could also almost make as if there had been no war, even though they had been for 20 years confronting each other. But on his part, Villamediana's pomp was designed to impress not only his hosts, but equally and most importantly, the population of the towns that they were to pass through. Had it been the initially planned itinerary, the display of trumpets, horses, and carriages would have been performed on the route from Dover to Greenwich on a 4-day journey with stops in, here we go, Canterbury, Sittingbourne, and Rochester. These towns were accustomed to the arrival of foreign ambassadors and embassies, as this was the common route into London from the continent. However, contemporary commentators give testimony that such a train was one of the most outstanding displays to travel across Kent in that period. As here we have a quotation from Charles Chester, that was on the occasion of the attempt of the Cobham plot to dethrone James and instead put Lady Arabella Stuart on the throne. He says in a letter, "It grieves my soul these troubles should happen while the brave Spanish ambassador came through Kent with incredible pomp, and I like a dull dog in an ambush, lurking for the liberty of my lord." I like very much this quotation because it's almost poetical in its expression. So Villamediana's mission could not finish in London as had been planned, because by the time he arrived, the raging plague of 1603 had sent the king and his court away from the city into the countryside. The audience was therefore organized to take place in the Royal Palace in Woodstock, and Villamediana was accordingly commanded to continue his journey to Oxford. This first prolongation of the journey required a measure of improvisation from both the Spanish visitors and the English hosts. The opportunity to leave London behind and continue the progress along less trodden paths gave Villamediana and his retinue the chance of getting to be known by parts of the population that may have never known of such an event or witnessed a band of foreigners comparable to a small invading army advancing inland. This part of the journey took 5 days, traveling from Greenwich to Oxford and making stops at Kingston, Staines, Maidenhead, and Henley. And in Henley, they were received with great ceremony by the Earl of Devonshire. Charles Blount had been the leader of the latest campaign against the rebels in Ireland and had notoriously defeated the Spaniards in the Battle of Kinsale, only a year before this occasion took place. So Villamediana, being welcomed by Devonshire, could have been understood as a sort of humiliation or an act of defiance. He could have been greeted by any other less conspicuous lord, but no record is left of the reasons to choose Devonshire for this mission, other than that he was equal in rank to Lord Dorset, who had greeted the French ambassador. As it happened, Villamediana opted for a different and easier option than to express discomfort, and instead he remarked that Devonshire was a man of whose name and action he has had very honorable report, and was the only nobleman that he desired to see. Thus, Villamediana turns an unfavorable situation into a favorable one, deciding to interpret his reception by the latest aggressor of Spain as a sign of reconciliation and true goodwill. The Relacion muy verdadera does not inform its readers of the victory over the Spanish troops of Devonshire, and instead gives a list of Devonshire's titles and explains that he presented Villamediana with a deer, which is la mayor fiesta que se hace en esta tierra, he explains. So in Oxford, Villamediana establishes a sort of mini court for himself, and as Louis Luckner explains, he is lodged in Christ Church, which he has already trimmed with his hangings and furniture. In 2 of his rooms, he has hanged up clothes of state equal in every way, both in breadth and length, to those of the king, which are usual in our court. And also the author of the Relacion is very boastful about the magnificence of the court that he establishes. And he says, the English were astonished of the size of the house he brought with him. And this is true, for one of the glories of this journey has been that the Count carried with him everything that was needed without needing to buy a nail to hang on the way. However, the journey did not end here. Once more, La Segunda Parte starts by announcing that on the 19th of September, one of the chamberlains of Villamediana died of a sudden illness, and that the planned audience was cancelled because of the rumors that he had fallen victim to the plague. Instead, they are advised to travel to Southampton, where they should wait for further orders. While Villamediana proceeds, this time towards the south coast, not knowing when or how, or even if he will be able to have an audience, James himself did not stand still. If we compare both itineraries, we can see that while Villamediana was staying in the most important towns of his way, the king chose to reside in smaller manors owned by noblemen where he imposed his presence. James was clearly avoiding the larger towns to escape from the plague, and decided to spend this first summer as King of England hunting in the woods. However, wherever he established his very reduced court, he brought the plague with him, as we learn from this letter from Sir Thomas Edmund to the Earl of Shrewsbury. Where he says, the court hath been so continuously haunted with sickness by reason of the disorderly company that do follow us, as we are forced to remove from place to place and do infect in all places where we come. We are now going within a few days from hence to Winchester to seek a purer air there. And by reason that the Spanish ambassador hath had one of his company lately dead of the plague at Oxford, his audience, which was appointed to have been given him here, is deferred till the king's coming to Winchester, which doth nothing please his greatness. And then he goes on to say that that they were renewed orders for banishing suitors from the court. So they are trying to keep people away from the court and be as reduced as possible. So while the king is hiding and reducing his court, Villamediana proceeds in a stately fashion with his 150 men to Southampton, where once again he establishes himself with all the pomp that his magnificent luggage provided. Finally, the audience is announced for the 5th of October, more than a month after the embassy had arrived in England. Much of the Segunda Parte is dedicated to the description, not of the audience per se, but of the preceding reception of Villamediana to William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, who had been sent to accompany Villamediana from Southampton to Winchester. This should not be surprising, as the splendor of the embassy was designed not only to be able to be splendid as they traveled, but also to act as hosts in a foreign land. So the purpose of carrying so much luggage with them was to impress when they were settled in a place. And so the same as in Oxford, when they settled in Southampton, Villamediana decorates his house with all the furniture he has brought from Spain. When Pembroke comes to Villamediana's lodgings to escort him to Winchester, he is invited to a meal which he cannot refuse, despite the fact that this meant postponing the journey to Winchester at the risk of arriving late, which they do for the audience with the king. At this point, the narrator offers a very detailed description of how the place was decorated with all the accoutrements they had brought from Spain, including tapestries, silverware, dinnerware, and even paintings and substantial furniture. And well, I must apologize for this sort of longer quotation, but this is the last. Even though the house was small, it was very well trimmed. The first room where a meal would be served had a tapestry of Scipio and Hannibal, all made in silk, which had never been hanged before. A canopy made of golden silk in yellow and blue velvet, with many velvet chairs, a long table for 40 people, covered with a very good white cloth and very well embroidered serviettes full of lace, which are not used here because they are not very refined. There were 3 sideboards, one with gold and silver, full of platters, bowls, and cups, and more than 30 other pieces, another sideboard with silver, with platters, jars, and flasks of different shapes, braziers, and other pieces, and another base silver and glass pieces to drink. While the food was laid, they entered a room further in to wash their hands. There was a hanging of blue brocade embroidered full of golden tassels, a bed covered with the same, 4 buffets with table covers of the same cloth, and very good bureaus from Germany made of ivory and ebony, images and paintings. So thus, Villamediana is able to perform a splendid display of hospitality to the English courtiers. Finally, the audience with King James is a success a few days on that day, and the narrator announces that peace talks will ensue, even though procurers from France and the states of Holland were making diligencias contra la paz. We have to ask ourselves, and with this I conclude, whether all the unforeseen circumstances that Villamediana had to overcome were not, after all, to his advantage. At any rate, he was able to display this pomp for a longer period and in a wider geographical area that could have been anticipated. There was little subtlety in this performance, based on sheer number and size, but ultimately this was a measure of how much the Spaniards were willing to spend on establishing relations with the new English monarchy and how they perceived power should be displayed. All in all, this is a curious case of how the plague derailed diplomatic protocol, forcing improvisation where improvisation should have no place, turning guests into hosts. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Berta, for that fascinating paper, uncovering, I'm sure, for many of us, lots of new information using these Spanish sources. Sorry, I am actually live, aren't I? I just want to make sure that this is actually working. Yes, okay. I think I mentioned at the outset that we'll take questions at the end after Anun's paper. So we'll move on now to Anunciación Carrera de la Red, who is also teaching in the Department of English Philology at the University of Valladolid, where she specializes in history and cultural heritage. Anun works on Anglo-Spanish relations, particularly in the holdings in Spanish special collections. And her paper today is A Travelling Court and Household for the Prince of Wales, the Troublesome Jornada to Santander of September 1623. The floor is yours, Anun. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark, for your kind words. It's a pleasure to be here, sharing this seminar with my dear friend Berta and the rest of members of the Valladolid project. Thanks also to, and very especially to the Warburg Institute for the opportunity, and to all those attending for their interest. I've prepared some slides that I would now like to share, and I look forward to speaking to you in the final round of questions. My talk deals with the journey that the future Charles I of England made from El Escorial to Santander in September 1623, when he was still Prince of Wales. He was departing from the court in Spain after having spent 6 months negotiating his marriage to the Spanish king's sister, Infanta Maria. As you may know well, it is agreed that the marriage settlement was half, if not totally, broken before Charles departed for England. So in truth, no one should expect this return trip to shed any decisive light on why those negotiations eventually shipwrecked. But perhaps this is yet to be seen, especially if one coincides with Glyn Redworth that Segovia was to be the place where a new prince would put an end to his Spanish match. The preparations and the most spectacular entertainments that were offered to the prince along the jornada were recounted by a contemporary court journalist, Andrés de Almansa y Mendoza, in Partida del Serenísimo Príncipe de Valia. Most of the references that Spanish and British historians have made to Charles's return trip are through these texts or its derivatives. I now know that Almansa stays almost silent about half of the journey, and that what he does say about the other half is wrong several times, so that many misconceptions about the trip have come down to us with the circulation of his partida. It is clearly the case of this abridgment of the travel of 1848, where it is said that the prince left Madrid and reached Santander, traveling by easy journeys and lodging in the castles of the provincial nobility. This talk will prove how romanticized this is, surely as much as Almansa was inclined to propagate only the brightest side of Philip IV's Spain. Today, I intend to reconstruct the main course of events during Charles's jornada by drawing on archival material kept in the Archivo General de Simancas, as well as the minutes of the council and account books preserved in the municipal archives of the cities and towns where the entourage stopped. Unfortunately, due to time constrictions, you will be deprived of the most entertaining details of the courtly and popular receptions given to the Prince of Wales, to be able to concentrate instead on the difficulties and conflicts lived during the journey. This will be my attempt to show the ways in which the material conditions of itineraries may influence the ways of diplomatic relations in state journeys, and even, as in this case, seriously risk its success. Apparently, the Spaniards had drawn up a jornada lasting 20 days, but it was believed that the Prince of Wales would have cut it short by his own direction. Indeed, Santander, a rather small fishing and trade port on the Cantabrian coast, was surprisingly selected as the place of embarkation. Despite its narrow entrance, it was preferred to the better anchorage of Coruña, because it was nearer to England and also nearer to Madrid. Besides, instead of traveling through Burgos, which is here marked with a yellow dot, it was decided that past Valladolid, the entourage would be leaving the Camino Real at Dueñas to head straight north. This must have been done consciously ignoring this, that beyond Dueñas, there would be no posts for the relay of horses and mules, nor inns for the refreshment of people. And beyond Carrión, not even carriageways, and that few towns and villages in the mountains could be expected to have adequate lodgings to accommodate the prince and his company. Coming with the prince was a junta of 5 representatives of the King's Council of State: Cardinal Zapata, the Count of Gondomar, and the Marquis of Aitona, with the Count of Monterrey acting as president and Andrés Losada as secretary. In the maintenance of law and order, they were aided by the alcaide, Diego Francos de Garnica. The Prince of Wales's retinue consisted of no less than 40 lords, gentlemen of the chamber, and servants, to attend and assist him at his dressing and provide companionship. The Duke of Buckingham oversaw them, and ushers and halberdiers were commended to guard access to his chamber during the night. The Prince's guard was entrusted to the Baron of Kensington, and the Spanish and Almain guards were summoned to escort the group. the latter under the command of the Count of Barajas, who in addition undertook the duties of High Steward. Charles was carrying his own carriage and another one for his wardrobe, and at least 9 coaches plus litters were set up with new upholstery and wheels to be used by the different personalities. The horses and mules were put under the care of Francisco Zapata. The household had, sorry, this is the other one. Yes, the household had 100 Spanish officers and servants approximately, staffing the waiting service, bakehouse, cellar, kitchen, arras, chandlery, with burden wagons and carts carrying victuals and equipment. These nearly 200 people started off from the Royal Monastery and Palace of San Lorenzo de El Escorial, northwest of Madrid, passed through the Sierra of Guadarrama, traversed the plains of Segovia, Valladolid, and Palencia, up to the foothills of the Cantabrian Ridge, and there got first through the peaks and valleys, and next all the way down to the seaport of Santander. Here you have all the stops they made from the 9th to the 22nd of September. The seaport was reached in little more than 10 days. No stopover was made in any locality after a day's travel, and an average 40 kilometers were made every day, starting at 5 a.m. and advancing until evening time, under the sun of Castile and the rain in Cantabria. On the 12th of September, Charles departed from the king and his family to start off his journey from El Campillo near El Escorial. In 45 minutes, the Prince, Monterrey, Gondomar, and the Duke of Buckingham had arrived in Guadarrama, where the Count of Barajas had everything ready to stop overnight at the Casa de las Cadenas. Álvarez de Quiñones, the engineer, had already leveled the mountain pass of Fuenfría, filling the potholes with the stones and clearing the run-off areas to curb the sides of the ways, so that at 4 a.m. the Prince of Wales could start his ride up the valley, followed by wagons and carts, which, according to the poet, were so overflowing with provisions that the help of oxen was needed to be able to reach the top. Lunch was readily prepared at the hunting lodge of Balsain, and the prince and his retinue arrived in Segovia around 3:30 p.m., when they weren't expected until the break of night. Fortunately, the Count of Chinchon had managed to set up Charles's privy room in the royal stronghold of the Alcázar. He carefully followed the instructions that the entertainments were more apparent than costly. For example, the expense of the gold and silver minted in Charles's presence and presented to him stayed far from the limit he'd been marked, but was enough to fuel the legend of the prince's liberality toward the commoners. Contrarily, the horse tournament arranged by the local authorities was less moderate than recommended because, as some of the members of the local council complained, the gentlemen's display of feathers and white wax torches had cost a good 500 reals each pair. The prince retired early. He was departing before sunrise. Little did it matter that the cardinal, the marquis, and the secretary had only just arrived from Madrid for want of suitable mounts. After the passage of Guadarrama, the beasts were already too fatigued, some even useless. They wrote to Olivares asking that they were confiscated, or else the journey threatened to be too much to endure. A similar welcome was given in Valladolid. The chancellors had found a dozen fine beds with silk linen that were transported and reassembled in the palace for the use of the English lords and gentlemen. The streets of Valladolid were water cleaned, the balconies adorned with pendants, and the commodities of artisans and traders displayed outside the shops along the streets. At around 2:30 p.m., the prince's carriage entered through the Puerta del Campo, progressed across the main square, past the churches of the Cruz and Angustias, before reaching the royal palace. When the Chancellor arrived to kiss the Princess of Wales's hand, Charles was standing by a buffet wearing a green and blue shaded suit embroidered in gold. The President, jurists, and justices bowed very deep, and the local authorities followed suit. Charles was then taken to the Palacio de la Ribera down by the river, where he fell in love with this Veronese painting and this Giambologna sculpture of Samson, which were promised as gifts and shipped to London through the agency of Sir Balthazar Gerby. When Prince Charles returned before sunset, he received the local noblemen, had supper, and rising from the table, watched the fireworks from the main balcony. The palace square was lit with lamps. There was music and also mounted fireworks, but of course, the prince was ready to retire. Monterrey and Buckingham took their chance to suggest stopping over in the city of Valladolid for one day. They explained this would give time to change mounts to continue journeying. He and Buckingham had an argument, but the prince had no intention whatsoever to stop. In fact, for the past 2 days, he had been visibly displeased. The day after Segovia, stopping over Santa Maria de Nieva, he had only gone out to the fields briefly, but sufficiently to see a ring of peasant women dancing and the candles that lit the townspeople's windows on the way back. He had chosen to go out alone in the sole company of his English servants. He did the same at Olmedo on the following day before entering Valladolid. The locals had strained their efforts to offer bull runs and luminaries in his honor, but again he refused to attend and did not accept the company of the Spanish gentlemen during his evening walk. The junta could not hide this from the king and wrote, "He appears to come so displeased that he does not want to see anything." They believed, they knew what had brought his discontent. While staying in Santa Maria, he had been handed a letter from His Majesty, written on that same day. Philip IV offered that 8 of the Armada galleons that were harbored in Coruña would be dispatched to Santander in case the English fleet should not arrive in time to escort the prince back to England. In that letter, the king had changed his usual sign of Felipe for Yo el Rey. The junta's secretary kindly asked him to please remedy that so that the Prince of Wales would not travel so dissatisfied. And the king's reply was, "The prince is not right to lament that what I do with His Highness, as I do with the Emperor, the King of France, and other kings. I find there is reason to change my style." And he kept on using Yo el Rey in his correspondence, at least during the rest of the journey. As the retinue left the lands of Palencia, a sense of urgency would come over them. A footman had been dispatched to walk the itinerary, and the Lord Mayors and Alcaides had received confirmation that the prince would stay at their place, along with instructions to provide beds, provisions, and entertainment following the king's command. Herrera de Pisuerga, one of the towns on the way, for instance, did plan the warmest reception and spent the money it did not have in Charles's lodgings and the balls, comedies, and dances they could only afford at the festivities of their patron saint. Aguilar could only improvise a fishing feat in the river, which, good for them, the English enjoyed very much, especially when a diver caught a 12-pound trout with his own hands. However, many of these efforts went unnoticed because the junta did not record them. The real worry now was the mountains and the embarkation. From Reynosa onwards, there were no more carriageways. The prince was ready to make as many as 10 leagues every day. Now that he had dismounted, But that could not be the general case. Only 20 of the 40 confiscated mules had been sent over. Everybody was hiding them, as the alcaide would explain angrily. The mules won't be obtained just because. Better would it be that it were declared who'll be paying for them. They were traveling through ways scarcely anyone had ever trod, as Quiñones, the engineer, would report. They went down Pie de Concha in great danger, and through the valley of Cayón, the current of the river had to be divided into 4 branches to let the carts wade through the river. The provisioning for the prince's sea journey, with which the king wanted to impress the prince, had to be limited to what was available in those sterile parts: cows, rams, hens, chicken, wine, oil, vinegar, flour, and wood. But no oranges, lemons, peaches, grapes, or spices were to be found in Cantabria. They attempted to fill in the gap by offering the prince to take with him the best saddle and litter mules and donkeys that had taken them there, but the purveyor fell ill and the beasts stayed behind. And Cardinal Zapata, who had been entrusted with the matter, cleared his blame rather rudely. Blame another one if he can be found at all. The rain had made an appearance, and the prince had decided to take command, lest his embarkation was endangered. He sent his guard captain to Santander to make provisions for himself, to prevent any likely delay on the part of the Spaniards. He left his carriage to ride on horseback at such a speed that the prince passed ahead the household officers and their wagons. In fact, when Finney came to meet him, knowing that he was near Santander, the Prince of Wales was coming in the sole company of Cardinal Zapata and Monterrey. Buckingham was ill, and Aytona and Gondomar were lagging because their litter mules were exhausted. The prince was received with salutes, took the key of the city that was offered to him, put it back on the tray, and headed for the docks. He embarked on his vessel and only narrowly escaped drowning. The Bay of Santander had a very narrow entrance and could be deliberately obstructed, and to prevent that, the prince had ordered the ships to anchor outside the bay. When he took the barge to reach his vessel, the storm would not let them reach neither the ships nor the shore. On the 6th of September, the members of the junta had received the royal dispatches commanding them to carry the Prince of Wales to port. They had to see that during the way, particular care was taken of his comfort and pleasure. All the Englishmen accompanying him were lodged and treated with much love and lavish attention, and all conflicts and grievances were avoided in such a way that they arrived and embarked gladly and satisfied. On looking back at these orders, one wonders whether at all the itinerary could have been followed without adding so much unnecessary tension. And one is relieved to remember that on the 7th of October, the Prince of Wales arrived safely in England to wild popular celebration. Thanks very much.